We're going to talk about Dojo grids in XPages. My name is Brad Balasadis. I have been developing Notes Domino applications for 17 years now and focused almost exclusively on XPages over the past 3 years. I have the good fortune to work with the brilliant XPages development team at PSC Group. And as Howard had mentioned, I've been blogging specifically about Dojo grids a lot, but about XPages in general at accelerant.net. And you can see contact information there below as well to connect with me on Twitter and Skype. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk all about Dojo grids in XPages. We're first going to look at the Dojo Data Grid control that's available in XPages. We'll take a look at how to create a grid and some of the features that it comes with. We're also going to talk about how to add a lot of additional features into that grid, working with sorting and opening documents, searching and editing columns. Then we'll talk about taking it a step further with converting it to a Dojo EnhancedGrid. So we'll see how to convert that, and we'll take a look at a few of the plugins that you can use to get even more functionality. And at the end, we'll take a very brief look at the Dojo TreeGrid to show how you can also use a grid for categorization and to get counts and totals. So we do have a lot to cover, so I'm going to move quickly. So let's just jump right in. The Dojo Data Grid control, first thing you need to know is that it's not a core XPages control, so you have to be aware of the availability. It's something that's been a part of the extension library for a while. It also is part of Notes in Domino 853 if you have Upgrade Pack 1. Now this is an important distinction. A lot of people confuse this with a fixed pack, but if you're not familiar, the Upgrade Pack is actually a separate installation that's not a fixed pack, but what it does is it gives you a subset of extension library controls and builds them right into Notes in Domino for you. So if you have that Upgrade Pack, you've got this subset of controls from the extension library that IBM has vetted and they've agreed to support. And continuing that evolution, that subset of controls from the extension library is baked directly into Notes 9. So any of these three ways, if you've got any of these three configurations, you'll have the data grid control available to you. And when you put this control on a page, it creates a Dojo Data Grid module. So I guess it's a good place to start just to talk about why would we consider using the data grid. And you know, first point on here, I say kind of tongue-in-cheek, but one great reason is because it's not a view panel. I think probably almost all of us, when we started with XPages, we start with view panels because they're, quite frankly, the simplest way to surface notes data in XPages. So it looks familiar. It's kind of like a notes view. The whole point of it is to kind of replicate that view functionality in XPages. But the problem is, it's kind of similar, but the users are actually losing a little functionality that they're used to in the Notes client because you don't have that direct, typing to jump to a category. You don't have all that searching built in, so it can actually make your XPages application seem like a little bit of a step backwards, and that's definitely not the goal that we're shooting for when, whenever we get budget to do a project that's modernizing an application, taking it to the browser with XPages. So one of these things to consider is that the grid gives you a very different interface. And the grid also has a lot of features, some of which some of the other display controls have and some that they don't. So we'll take a look at that, but there are a lot of features that the grid has available, and it's important to understand what those features are just so that you can make a good decision the next time you have to figure out how you're going to display data in an XPages application. Another good reason to use the Dojo grids is that Dojo is already available on the Domino server. You can get all this extra functionality and you don't have to install anything. You don't have to license anything. You don't have to pay for any additional software. You can get additional functionality and it's already sitting on your Domino server and it's available there. So, and along with that, these enhanced plugins are available. So Dojo is already loaded, a subset of Dojo is already loaded, with every XPage that you use, but there's a lot more modules sitting on the server that you can add to your page to give you extra functionality. So to create a data grid, we basically just have three steps. It's not much more complicated than anything else. First step is to create a REST service, and that provides the data for your grid. Your second step is you just add a data grid control to the page, and then you bind it to the REST service because that's where it's going to get its data. And then the third step is to add columns to the grid, to display the data. So before we move any further, I want to take a few moments to talk about REST services because this could be a very new concept for a lot of us. And basically, a REST service is just a standard for exchanging data, in a browser. REST services are a very common way that data is provided to a grid. And the good news is that there is a REST service control available in XPages. So if you've got the extension library or 853 upgrade pack 1 or notes 9, basically if you've got any of these setups that give you the data grid control, then you've also got a REST service control available for you. So you use that to provide your grid data. So to create a REST service, basically all you need to do is drag and drop it onto a page. You select the type of service, and here I'm showing the view JSON service, but another type that you may use would be called the view item file service, and there are some slight differences to them, but just be aware that those are two common types that you can use to provide data for a grid. So after you select the service type, you're going to set the content type to application JSON. You select the name of the view that you want the grid to get the data from, and then there's this default columns property that you can set to true. And basically what that'll do is after you point the REST service to a view, if you set default columns to true, the REST service will automatically create a column for every column that exists in your view. So it's a very quick way to make all of the data from a view available in a REST service and available to a grid. But of course, this being XPages, there's more than one way to do everything. So if you don't want to just use the default columns in the grid, or even if you do want default columns, there are additional things you can do to customize the data that the REST service is going to provide. You can compute columns just like you can in a Notes client view. So you can use server-side JavaScript to combine some information or perform lookups and determine programmatically what you want to display. There's a set of system columns that are available, and this is mostly document metadata, things like the UNID, created, modified, those kinds of pieces of system information that are available. And a few of those are automatically made available in a REST service, but there's a larger list that you can select from. And of course, if you really need to customize the content of a REST service, you can actually completely write your own. So just to be aware that if the REST service, by default is not meeting your needs, there are things you can do to customize it. Last thing I want to mention briefly is how to verify the data in a REST service. There's a property called pathinfo, and this is very useful because once you set that pathinfo property, you can then use a URL like this that will load the XPage that contains the REST service, / and then whatever the name of that pathinfo is, and it will show you the data that the REST service is providing. And this is important because if you see an error in the front end on your grid, it's not going to give you much information. It's just going to say there was some kind of error getting grid data. Okay, so there's not going to be much help troubleshooting. But if you set this pathinfo, you can then go and look at the content that the REST service is providing, and you can see if there's some kind of problem with it. So back to our steps for creating a grid. Again, it's just 3 steps to create that REST service, add the grid and bind it, and then add a couple grid columns. So we're going to take a look at how to do that quickly. And just so you can see here, this is just a Notes client view. I'm using kind of a subset of data from David Lee's fake names database. So we've got this view here. It's called by name first, and this is just a bunch of people. And the view is kind of sorted by first name and has contact information. So that's going to kind of be the baseline data that we're going to be displaying throughout here. So we're going to create a page with a grid, just so we can see the process happen here. As I mentioned, under data access, we've got a REST service control. And once I have that control, under properties here, I'm going to go to service, and there's a plus icon to let me add the type of service. I'm going to say it's a view JSON service. As I mentioned, I'm going to set the content type to application JSON. I'm going to set this default columns property to true, and down here I'm going to choose a view. Okay, and the last thing, as I had mentioned, we want to be able to verify this. So I'm going to set the path info property to grid data. Okay, so now we've got a REST service, and that will give us the data. Now under Dojo layout, I can get a Dojo Data Grid control. So now that I drop that onto the page, as mentioned, the first thing I really need to do is use this store component ID property and select the REST service, because that's what's going to bind the grid to the REST service in order to read the data. So that was step 2. In step 3, we just take grid columns here and drag them in. And there's no drop down or anything to choose a field name, so you just have to know what they are and type them in. And basically, these field names will match what the name of the REST column is. And the names in the REST service will be taken from the underlying Notes client view. So as you can see, it took me about a minute there. I created the REST service, added a grid, and added 2 columns here. We've got a grid serviced. So getting up and running can be pretty quick with a grid. So now that we have something there, let's take a look at some of the features that it has, by default. So out of the box, one of the best features the grid gives you is infinite scrolling. And this alone is a tremendous feature improvement from a lot of the other display controls, whereas a view panel, for the most part, you're building paging. And that's just not a common way that people want to work through a large set of data, by clicking a next arrow and paging through. So this is a much more modern interface, whereas the grid, you just keep dragging the scroll bar, and it will just keep loading more data until it gets to the end. So that's definitely a great feature that the grid provides, and that's out of the box. You don't have to do anything to enable that. Grid also gives you adjustable column widths, so the user can drag the column sizes to be larger or smaller as they need to. The grid gives you some row highlighting, where it will give every other row a subtle light gray background. And as you drag your mouse over grid rows, it will also give you a brighter highlight, just so you have a visual indicator of where you're at. The grid also gives you extended selection mode by default, which means that if you're selecting rows of data, you can just click on a row, or you can shift-click to get a group of rows, or you can control-click to select non-contiguous rows. And another thing the grid can do for you is you can have actually entries that span multiple rows. So we're kind of used to views and even grids when we see them just being one row per document, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's a grid row control that you can use, and then you put columns inside the rows, and you can have a multi-row display. So some of the additional properties for the grid that you can set, there's a row selector property, and basically that just gives you a solid gray box to the left of a row that is a place where you can just click that once to select the row. So that's not built into the grid by default. I'm not sure why, but anything you need to do that selects a row, you'll need to add a row selector. There's the auto height property that basically you set this to a number, and it's a number of rows that you want the grid to display at a time. So if you want your grid to be 10 rows high, you give the auto height a number of 10. But I will say that I think it treats this more as a suggestion, because I've seen times when I've assigned the auto height to 10, and it will show me 9 rows, or it'll show me 12 rows, or I'm not sure exactly what goes into that, but just to point out, it more treats it like a suggestion for you. The rows per page property basically just has to do with the grid and how it manages memory. So if you start to scroll off the page, and you say if your rows per page was set to 25, it'll get the next 25 rows in memory and the next 25 at a time. So that's more just back-end memory management. You can adjust that as your performance needs. The grid property to escape HTML and data, basically it will automatically filter out any HTML content and not pass it through to the front end. But if you need HTML content in your grid, you can set that property to false, and it won't filter it out automatically for you. Now, that's not the safest way to go, because it kind of opens you up to cross-site scripting attacks, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later, because there is an alternative as well. So the grid, the loading message and error message properties, basically just give you the ability to override the default messages that would display, while the grid is loading if it's taking time, or if there is some kind of an error getting the data. And finally, the direction property, you can set your grid to orient left to right or right to left. Just be aware that there seems to be a bit of a quirk where if you orient the grid right to left, it loses column titles. So hopefully that's something that gets worked out soon. Well, let's take a quick look at some of these features in action here. As I mentioned, this down the left-hand side here, this is the row selector. So I can click on that in order to select the row, and that's not in the grid by default. I can also shift-click to get a whole section of rows, or I can control and click to select non-contiguous rows. Again, as I mentioned, we can kind of drag column sizes to be different. And also, as I mentioned, you've got this row highlighting. It may be a little hard to see that every other row has a subtle, light gray background, but I'm sure you can see the hover color as I move the mouse over. So these are just some of the attributes and the features that the grid provides for you. So next I want to talk a little bit about Dojo Attributes. And Dojo Attributes are used a lot with grids to add features, but it's also important to understand the concept of Dojo Attributes in your broader XPages development, because there are a lot of controls that have Dojo Attributes that you can add to them in order to use properties and features that are a part of the Dojo module, but that they don't have a property for, built into Domino Designer. So this is a good concept to get down even outside of grids. So in this case, we're going to talk about just two properties that you can add via Dojo Attributes that you can't add with direct grid properties. And there's two ways you can get to attributes. Under the Dojo subtab, there's a Dojo Attributes list, or if you go to all properties, you can add them there as well. So the first one we're going to take a look at is column reordering. And as you can see here, this is when the grid is selected. When I click on the Dojo subtab, and I can come over here and click the Add button and add an attribute. The name is column reordering, and the value is true. And just by adding that little attribute, I give the user the ability to click on column headers and drag them around the grid to reorganize them. And just to mention, there's a second way you can add the attributes, for the grid. If you're in all properties, you can go to Dojo, Dojo Attributes, click this plus button, and then I could add the same attribute that way as well. So there's two different ways to do it. The other attribute we want to add to the grid is called auto width, because by default, the grid takes up the entire width of its container. As we saw here in our grid that we created just in a couple moments, this thing took up the entire page. So the striping is going across the page, the scroll bar is all the way to the right, but that just doesn't look as nice. So if I come back here to my first demo, this one has the auto width property set. So it will only make the grid take up the width that it needs based on the column sizes. So this is a good feature to add, and it's very simple to put in there with a Dojo attribute where the name is auto width and the value is true. So moving on, the next thing I want to touch on is a few properties of the grid column. So each individual column doesn't have a lot of properties, but there's a couple that you really need to be aware of. The label property is basically the column title. So by default, that will be whatever the name of the REST service column was, which will automatically be whatever the name of the view column was underneath. So if you don't need to change that, that's what you're going to get, basically the name of the underlying view column. But you can override that by setting the label property. The width property is pretty self-explanatory. You can set the default size for the column. There's a hidden property, so you can compute whether the column should be displayed. The editable property of the column is basically you set that to true, and then that allows that column to be turned into edit mode. And we'll talk more about that in a few moments. But the one I really want to focus on here is the formatter property, because this is a bit of a different concept that we're used to. The formatter property basically takes the name of a client-side JavaScript function. And that's a function that's designed to process the data in the column before it's displayed. So in this example here, if I want to take my column data and display every value in all uppercase, I'd write a function like this, called all upper, And basically, one of these formatter functions will automatically receive one property, and that's basically the value that would be displayed in the column by default. Within that function, I can process that however I want to, and then whatever I return is what's actually going to be displayed in the column. So in this case, I'm just taking that column value and sending it to all uppercase and returning it back. But I can have this logic return something completely unrelated. So that's what formatter functions can do for you. Basically, you put those functions either in an output script block or in a client-side JavaScript library. As long as they're available to your page and the grid can see it, you just set that formatter property with the name of that function that you want to process the data in the column. And we're actually going to come back more to formatter functions, and we'll see that a few more times as we get into more advanced features where the formatter really becomes useful. So next I want to talk about sorting in the grid. The grid has this nice feature that it automatically attempts to give you ascending and descending sorting on every single column in the grid, but it's important to know that the sorting is only going to work if that sort option is already available in the underlying view. So in the screenshot here, this is the properties of a view column, and basically you need this click on column header to sort property, and if that's set to ascending or descending or both, that's what will allow the grid to sort the data in those directions. But I'm going to assume that you don't have every view that you're working with able to be sorted ascending and descending on every column. So we actually have to look at doing a little bit of work to prevent some sort options because we don't want the user to be clicking on a column thinking that it's sorting and it's really not doing anything. So in order to do that, we have to write a function and we attach it to a property of the grid called canSort. And that function will basically determine what the column number is and whether it's allowed to sort, and then it'll return true or false based on whether that sort option is allowed. So essentially, we need to use this to prevent sorting on any sort options that the view can't support. So for an example down here, we've got this code here, and it will only allow even-numbered columns to sort. So we start here. Actually, let me step back for a second. There's no property for this built into the grid control, so we have to run code on the client load event of the page and attach a function to the grid's canSort property because I haven't seen another way to do that. And the other thing to understand is that whatever function you attach to the canSort property will receive one parameter, and that's going to be the column index. And basically, it'll be a positive number if it's asking for an ascending sort, or a negative number if it's asking for a descending sort. So on the on-client load event of our page, we can run code like this that says, digit by ID, and this DJX Data Grid 1 is the default name for grid control. So basically, up to this point, this code is just saying, get me a handle to my grid. And then this canSort property here, we're going to attach an anonymous function to it, and it's going to have one property. COL call is just a name that I gave it. It can be whatever you want. Just know that the index number will be passed in. And the logic in here is basically saying, it's going to check the modulus, the column divided by 2. If there's no remainder, then we know it's an even numbered column, so I'm going to return true and allow that column to sort. Otherwise, I'll return false and not allow that sort option. You could also modify this so that it only allows ascending sorts by checking whether the number is positive or anything like that. Whatever logic you need to prevent sorting, you can implement in one of these functions. So let's take a look at this in our grid. So as I mentioned, that function would only allow even-numbered columns to sort. So if I click on the first column here, nothing happens. I click on the second column, I can sort it ascending and then descending. I click on the third column, nothing happens. Fourth column, I can sort ascending and descending. Now, if we compare that to our grid out of the box, it will allow me to try to sort every column. Now, the problem comes in if I try to click on a column like the zip code, which is not sortable. So I'll click on it, and you can see I get this arrow here in the column header, but nothing changed. If I click on it again, the whole page refreshes, the arrow is pointing down, indicating that it's sorted descending, but nothing happened. So this is why we need to use that canSort property and write function to kind of prevent the options that aren't valid, because this can be very confusing to the user. It's going away, it's refreshing the page, I'm getting an arrow that's indicating a sort, but really nothing changed because that sort option was not supported. Okay, next let's talk about opening documents from the grid. Because like many of the display controls in XPages, there's no link built in. And you've probably seen, if you've worked with a repeat control or something like that, how you can use server-side JavaScript logic to read a document ID and build a URL that will open the page that you want with the current document. And with the grid, we have to take a bit of a different approach because the events that we have are client-side. So the grid has two client-side events available called onRowClick and onRowDoubleClick. And these functions automatically receive one argument, but it's an object that has a lot of properties available to it that we can use to ultimately get that ID, to figure out what document we're trying to open. Most important thing to understand with this is that the code you need is going to vary slightly based on the type of REST service that you're using. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, View.json service and View.item.file service are two common REST service types that you would use to provide data for the grid. But as you can see here, their output is slightly different. Whereas on the left here, the View.json service is immediately just an array of these document objects, whereas the View.item.file service has a couple of top-level items first, and then it even has an item called items, and then that contains the array of documents. So just be aware that just changes the approach slightly for how you're going to reach in and get the data. So here's an example of code you can use on one of those rowclick events if you're using a View.json service type REST service. And of course, there are several different ways to approach this. This is just one working solution. As I mentioned, those functions will receive an object that's got a lot of properties to it. You can access that by just referring to arguments subscript 0. That just gives me a handle to the first parameter that's passed into that JavaScript event function. So from that, I get a handle to the grid. That gives me the grid object. I can read the row index property, and then I'm going to reach into the grid and get that row. And from that row, I'm going to get the @UNID property. And now I can use that to build a URL to load the document. So, my page name.xsp $document ID equals, and then the UNID. And then now here, I can change the location of the page to that new page. So I'll be opening that XPage, the document that the user clicked on. So it's just a little bit of a different approach because this is all client-side JavaScript, and we have to go read information out of the REST service or the grid in order to get that to build a URL. But fortunately, it's still only a few lines of code, and this is already a working example that you can take and use. Now, as I mentioned, the code is slightly different if you have a View.item.file service. We'll still get the row index, but we can actually use that to reach right into the REST service and get its items property, with that specified index. So the code is a little more compact here. We can just use that and then pull the UNID attribute and then build that same URL and change the page to it. So those are just the two functions you can use so that when a user either clicks or double clicks on a row in your grid, it'll open the document as they would expect. Next, I just want to take a moment to briefly talk about searching in the grid. The good news is this works pretty much the same as it does with any other control. So if you've ever set up a full text search, on a view panel or on anything else, the process is very similar. All you need to do is create a search field, just a plain edit box, and you bind it to a scope variable. You'll set the REST services search property to that scope variable, and then you just need a button that when you click it, it just triggers a partial refresh. The key is that the partial refresh has to happen on the grid and the REST service. This is not something you have to usually consider when you're working with a view panel because the data source is usually within the view panel. but in the rest service, in the grid, the rest service actually sits outside of the grid. So you just have to be conscious to make sure that you're refreshing both of those things, because you could partially refresh the grid, but if the rest service hasn't been refreshed, then nothing has changed. So let's take a look at that briefly. So I could come here and do a full text search for John, and then it's got me all the people whose first name is John, as well as somebody who lives on John Daniel Drive. So that was just a basic full text search, and we can take a look at how that was implemented. So as I mentioned here, I've just got an edit box, and it's bound to a view scope variable called grid search. And then in my REST service here, expand service, we can see the REST service has a search property, and it's set to viewScope.gridSearch, the same thing. And then my search button here, there's no code here at all. All it does is to call a partial refresh on panel grid, which is this panel that is surrounding the REST service and the grid. So very simple implementation, very similar to the way it works, in your other controls. So you can that easily provide a full text search in your grid. Now I want to talk for a few minutes about editable columns, because this is one of the best features that the grid has, just built right in. It can be very handy to allow users to edit the data directly in line, so they don't have to open a document, put it in edit mode, save it, and go through changes. So if there are certain things that users need to just quickly be able to update, you can have editable columns in your grid, and this can be a very handy feature. So in general, you just set the editable property of a column to true, and then all the user has to do is double click in that cell, and it'll change it to edit mode, and they can just make changes to it. Now, the thing to understand is you just need to run a single line of client-side JavaScript to save any changes that are made, because otherwise the user will make a bunch of changes on the front end, and nothing will happen unless you call the save property or the save method of the REST service. So by default, this will use the REST service's JSID property if you've defined it. But if you haven't defined a JSID for the REST service, it'll just use whatever the ID is. The important thing to note here, and I don't know why this is, but for some reason saving changes back to the REST service doesn't do anything unless you have the auto height property set for the grid. It must have to do with something with memory management or something. I don't know if that's a quirk of just the grid control in XPages, or if that's the way it works with, with grids if you create them programmatically. But it's definitely something I noticed when working with this and testing it, that that auto height property does need to have some value in it in order for this to work. Now, just like saving changes in the grid, there's a method to undo the changes. And the REST service has a revert method, which in theory should be one line of JavaScript to dump the changes and and resume where you were before. But unfortunately, in practice, I have rarely seen that work. I'm not sure of any certain bug with it, again, or if it's a specific XPages issue, but it doesn't seem to work very well. But the good news is, all you have to do is have a button that does a partial refresh on the grid, and it'll have the exact same effect, because it'll refresh the content of the grid to what it was before without saving any changes. So fortunately, there is a very easy workaround. So when you have editable columns in the grid, you have a couple of options to set the type of field that the user is going to get to edit. Now, by default, it's the type cell, which is just a plain text field. But you could also make it a select, which is a drop-down list, and you can compute those options with server-side JavaScript. And you also have the ability to give the user a checkbox to work with. There's a couple other types in that cell type dropdown. There's the always edit type, which is not specifically a field type. It'll just give you a plain text input, and it'll always be in edit mode, so the user doesn't have to click or double click on the cell to change it to edit mode. So that's an option as well. And the last option in the list there, row index, has absolutely nothing to do with editing the column. That's basically if you just want like a row counter in the first column of your grid, you can add a grid column and set its cell type to row index, and it'll automatically give you row numbering. So let's take a look at how editable columns work here. So in this grid, I've set the first name, last name, and state fields to be editable. So if I can take this first name here and I can change it, and I've got an updated value, I can change the last name here. And as you can see, I set the state field to be a select, so I get a drop-down list of options. Okay, this row highlighting in yellow is not a built-in feature of the grid. That's something that I wrote some extra code to handle because I like the idea of there being some kind of a visual indicator that the user has modified data in the grid that has not been saved yet. So if I were to save this, now my changes are there, the yellow highlight goes away. I don't have time to dig into that highlighting code, but you can find that on my blog. I have written that out and shared that code. So the last thing I want to mention about field types in the grid with editable field types is that in Notes 9, you have another option where you can actually use a date picker to modify date fields in a grid. It's not a built-in option yet because nothing has changed with the grid control itself, but if you include the dojox.grid.cells.date text box module onto your page, you can just type that value into the cell type, and then you will get a date picker pop-up, to work with. And just be aware that this only works properly in Notes 9. In Notes 853 with Upgrade Pack 1, you can get the calendar pop-up to display, but it won't be able to save the data. And that's because this calendar pop-up is designed to work, or defined to be a feature that works as of Dojo version 1.7. And Domino 853 uses Dojo 161, whereas Domino 9 uses Dojo 1.8, so it can take advantage of this feature. Just to be aware, you have to write some extra, code to format dates because they, by default, show up in this very long format with dates and times and other codes and everything in it. But with a little bit of work, it is something that's possible, just to give you just another option for nice inline column editing. A few things to note about editable columns. The REST service's save function can actually take callback functions as well. And this can be very helpful if the save fails, because the save method in the REST service, it will respect your Domino security. So if you've got someone who's author level and they try to make a change and save it, but it's a document they didn't have access to, it will throw an error. Now, it's not going to tell you there's an error unless you pass something into this error callback. So you can define a function, with the onError, an anonymous function, to say, here, alert, there was an error saving your changes. And then when you call the save method of the REST service, you can pass this callback function into it, and then when something goes wrong, it'll pop that message up for the user. You can also send an onComplete message as well if you want to send a message back to the user, if the save happens as soon as it's done successfully. A couple other things to note. Editable columns, they work as is if you're using a view item file service for your REST service type. But if you're using a view JSON service REST service type, you need to have a website document that allows put operations on your site, or else it won't be able to save changes. Another important thing to note is that you can only edit columns that are mapped to a single field. And this makes sense because if you have a computed column and then you make a change to it, it wouldn't know how to distribute those changes back across multiple fields or, with some computation. So just keep that in mind. If you want data to be editable in the grid, it needs to map back to a single view column. Another thing to note is that the grid has a single click edit property, and that's actually what was in effect when I was showing you the demo there, where you only have to click once on a column cell to make it editable, whereas by default you have to double click in it. And as I mentioned before, the highlighting changes is not a built-in feature of the grid, but it's something that I have worked out and written about so that you can take advantage of that as well. Next, I just want to mention HTML in the grid, because as I mentioned earlier, by default the grid will parse out any HTML tags and just display plain text. But if you do need to display HTML content in your grid, one option that you have is to add a grid column that's got HTML data in it, and you can set that grid property, escape HTML and data, to false, and then it won't try to parse those tags out anymore. And this works, but it is not recommended because it leaves your site available to cross-site scripting. Now, I guess that's up to you to decide if you think that's a mitigated risk, if it's an internal app or whatever it is, but in general, it's just not the safest property to set. Unfortunately, when I was looking at how to display icons in grid columns, I came across a more secure way to use HTML in grid columns. So you can do this with the formatter function. This is like I was talking about earlier with the column property for the formatter. You can attach a formatter function to it, and then you can return image tags or any other kind of HTML tags, and they'll display in your grid, and you don't have to turn off that escape HTML data property. So let's take a look at this. Now in this grid here, I've got 3 columns that have pass-through HTML. The first one basically just displays the person's name in bold and italics. The second one, I've actually passed through a button that will run client-side JavaScript code and alert me with the person's name. And the third column has returned an image, so it displays an icon. So we can take a look at how those were set up. And essentially, this is done primarily in the REST service. As I mentioned earlier, we have this default columns property. It's set to true, but I've also added some custom columns as well. So the first custom column here, this basically just, it wraps bold and italic tags around first name and last name. And this grid entry here is a variable name that I gave to the grid so that I can access the documents that are displayed in it. So I have that handle to that document so I can read information and compute this column. So that's the first column. Second column is a little more complex to look at, but basically, again, combining the first and last name. And then this time I'm sending a button out, and the button on click, it calls an alert, and it passes the full name. And it's a little confusing to look at with the different sets of quotes and escape characters and all that stuff, but that's just because I'm writing server-side JavaScript that actually writes out client-side JavaScript. So there's a bit of a level of complexity to it, but the important thing is just knowing that all I had to do is compute a grid column with this information, and it passes through. Now the third one is not as custom grid column. To display the icon, I actually have a column that just reads the city, but I've got a formatter function called display icon. And that formatter function sits here in this output script block. And all this does, again, my formatter function automatically receives a value property, which is whatever value is going to be in the column. And I'm just checking the name of that city, and I'm returning an image tag based on that data. So this is client-side JavaScript, but I do have the ability to read a piece of information, execute some logic, and return HTML-related content, or in this case, an image tag based on that. So that's how I can display an icon and customize it based on the content that's coming through my grid. Okay, so all these things we've talked about so far are features of the base Dojo Grid. The next thing I want to talk about is looking at the Dojo EnhancedGrid, because you can get some even greater functionality that's available with these extra plugins. So the EnhancedGrid is a module that extends the Dojo Data Grid. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the EnhancedGrid modules are already sitting there on your server. You just have to add them to the page, because Dojo is available on the server, but only some of the Dojo modules are made available to the page by default. Whatever else that you want, we just include it on the page as well. So we're going to look at the EnhancedGrid because we can provide these enhanced features. And the important thing, as I mentioned briefly earlier, you have to just check for which features are available based on the version of Domino that you're using, because that determines the version of Dojo that's available. So the first thing we need to do is convert our grid to be an enhanced grid. See, by default, a Dojo Data Grid, if you look at it in Firebug, you can see that what it creates is a dojox.grid.datagrid. But we need that to generate an enhanced grid. So there's 3 steps to do that. The first step, we just load the enhanced grid module onto the page, and that just makes it available. Second step is to set the grid's Dojo type. And then the third step, we just have to add a couple of extra style sheets so that the formatting is proper. So to add that module to the page, within our XPage, so here I'm at the XPage level, under Resources, there's an Add button, and one of the options in there is to add a Dojo module. And then you just have to type in the precise name of the module, which in this case is dojox.grid.enhancedGrid. And again, that makes it available to the page to use. The second step is what actually applies it and makes it useful. So we can see here, when I select the Dojo Data Grid, under Dojo, there's a Dojo type field. And then I'll put in that same name, and that's going to tell my grid to use this enhanced grid module. And then finally, there's 2 style sheets that we need to load, because again, otherwise the grid alignment is just off. So the good news is we can use relative paths so that we don't need to know the full file path from the server's hard drive. You can start with this this .ibm xsp resources property here. Will give you a relative path to start with, and then you can build out the rest of the URL or the rest of the file location to the style sheets that you need. So once we do that, and then we load our page, we can look at Firebug and see now we've got a dojox.grid.enhancedGrid, and now it's ready for plugins. So the first plugin I want to talk about is D&D, and if you hear me say that, or you saw it in the menu of my demo earlier, if your heart skipped a beat a little bit because you're an old school gamer, I do have to apologize, because D&D plugin, as cool as it is not going to make your grid play Dungeons and Dragons with you. What it's going to do is give you the ability to drag and drop stuff around your grid. So this plugin will allow you to drag and drop columns or rows or cell data and just move things around the grid as the user wants to reorganize the data. The important thing to understand, this can be a little strange to get used to using. So you first select the content to drag, then you have to release the mouse button and then click on the data and actually drag it. Okay, and I'll show this in a moment. Most important thing to understand here, if you allow dragging and dropping of cell data, it automatically saves changes as soon as it's dropped. So be aware of that and probably take steps to prevent that option if you don't want that. Let's take a look at this on our grid. So as I mentioned, if I want to take this last name column and, so I click on the column, click on the data, and I want to drag it down here later in the grid, I can just do that to rearrange columns. As I mentioned, I can also click on a row and drag it and move it down. The neat thing is I can actually take a chunk of rows and actually select them and move them all at the same time as well. And also, as I mentioned, I can click on a cell and drag and drop it. And what it does is it changes the original field to be empty and overwrites the value in the field where I dropped it. And again, I think this is pretty dangerous, so just be careful if you're adding this to make sure you want the users to be able to reorganize the data, in this kind of a manner. So let's take a look at how we put that feature into place. Similar to creating the enhanced grid, the first thing we have to start by doing is loading the D&D plugin module. So we're going to go to Properties, Resources, Add, Dojo Module, and then again, the name precision and casing is very important here. So the module name is dojox.grid.enhanced.plugins.dnd. So again, the next step, now that the first step was to make the module available, the next step is to actually tell our grid to use it. And we're going to do this, as we'd seen earlier, by using Dojo Attributes. So to use any plugin in an enhanced grid, use the attribute called plugins. In this case, the attribute is plugins, and the value is set to this whole mess of curly braces, which really is available because there's a D&D config object that you can use if you want to define which drag and drop options are available. And again, as I mentioned, I would highly recommend preventing the cell drag and drop unless you really want the data to be modified that way. Because by default, if you set it up as I'm showing here, it'll give you all the selection options, to move data around. Next plugin I want to talk about is Filter, which I think is far and away the most useful plugin that's available. This plugin is going to add a filter bar to the grid. It gives you a pop-up that lets you enter up to 3 filtering rules, where the user can select a column, they can select a matching condition to say, the data it starts with, it ends with, and you can add up to 3 of those rules, and it will go and filter the grid data for you, and there is no coding required whatsoever, which is pretty incredible, and you can even sort the results. So let's take a look at how this works. So again, when I load the filter plugin, I get this filter bar here. I have my dialog, and I can say, do I want to match all the rules I enter or any of the rules? I get a drop-down that's automatically got all the columns in the grid. And I'm going to say, that my first name, I'm going to look for first name is John. And click this plus button here to add another rule. I'm going to say the state starts with N. And I'll click the filter button, and it'll take a moment. And when it comes back, now here I've got, that just searched 1,300 records. It gave me the 3 records where, John is the first name, and the state starts with an N. And I didn't have to do any programming whatsoever to make that work, which is pretty incredible. This is an amazing feature that you can put in EnhancedGrid with very little work. So to use this, again, like we've seen already a few times, first thing we need to do is load the right Dojo module. So we'll add this to the page, dojox.grid.enhanced.plugins.filter, and that makes it available. Second step, we add the attribute to the grid, and again, the attribute for any plugins, the attribute name is plugins, and then we set the value to filter true. And if you're going to use more than one plugin, you still only have one plugin's attribute. The value just gets to be, have more values in it. So now that we've loaded that filter module, we've added it to the page, now we're adding it to the grid. And then the last thing for the filtering, you just have to add one more style sheet, because if you don't, it'll still work, but the pop-up dialog, the alignment's a little bit off. So we add this one more style sheet, and that's all it took to add that filtering functionality to the grid. No code whatsoever. I didn't have to dig into the back end and do any programming or anything, which is pretty incredible. So briefly, just want to touch on a few more plugins that are, some of the plugins that are available for the EnhancedGrid. There's a print plugin that gives you the ability to either preview or print grid contents, and it'll let you, preview or print all in air quotes, because really all means whatever the first chunk of data is on the page. But you also have the ability to pass parameters and say, or to print whatever's selected, or to pass parameters to say print custom, and that's where you can define the rows to print. Similarly, there's an exporter function, although it doesn't do quite as much as it sounds like. It basically just gives you the grid data in a format that's ready to export, and you have to kind of do the work to actually take it the rest of the way, which is a bit more involved. But if you do want to see a solution for that, I have written about that on my blog, so you can take a look at it there if you want. And like the printing, you have the ability to export all, selected, or custom. And another plugin that can be really useful is called Menu, and this lets you build context menus so that if your users right-click on a column or a row or cells or a selected area, you can pop up a custom menu, and you build it with digit menus and digit menu items, and you can trigger client-side JavaScript methods to act on that data that's selected. So I think you would actually, kind of use these plugins in conjunction. So your menu on, selected rows could include the functions to print or export. So you can kind of use all these things together to really build some rich functionality in the grid. So in the last few moments here, just want to touch briefly on the Dojo TreeGrid, which is another Dojo grid module that you can get from the server. The TreeGrid gives you the ability to categorize your grid data, which is something that the other grids haven't been able to do. And with the tree grid, you can actually also do totals and counts. So in a lot of notes applications, categorized views with totals and counts, that's your reporting system. So if that's the kind of thing you need, then maybe a tree grid could be a helpful solution for you when you're taking your data, to the browser. It is important to know, though, that the tree grid extends the Dojo Data Grid module. It is not an enhanced grid, so you cannot use enhanced grid plugins, with the categorized grid. The documentation for the tree grid is pretty atrocious, and it appears that you actually can't even build a tree grid with the XPages Dojo Data Grid control. So we'll come back to that a little more in a moment, but just let me show you what this looks like first. So this is a categorized tree grid. I basically took that same view of data we've been looking at the whole time and applied it, the same data, a different view that was categorized by state that we're showing here. And basically we just have the plus and minus icon here to expand, and we can see, the same content we've been looking at, but now categorized. So at a high level, the steps to implement this, as I mentioned, this is more work because we can't use the Dojo Data Grid control to do it. So there's a little more work to get this involved. But once you have a working example, you can get it going pretty quickly. So the first thing you need to do is include several Dojo modules in style sheets, because when you're not using the Dojo Data Grid control, there's more resources you have to include manually that the control was already doing for you behind the scenes and you didn't realize it. So a lot of that's what kind of applies to a lot of these settings. So you include some modules and style sheets that the grid needs. You set the XPage property to parse Dojo on load, or else it won't generate the grid by default. You add a div tag to your page, and that becomes the target where the grid gets rendered. And then you write some code that runs on the on-client load event of the page, and that will define the grid structure. And then finally, you have to provide data for the grid. And at the moment, I haven't seen how to use an existing REST service to do it. So for the purpose of proof of concept, I have a solution that basically works with X agents that will write out the data in the JSON format that a categorized grid needs. And if you can see below here, here's a snippet from one sample of a tree grid that I found. And basically, this first line here would be a category level, and then it has a children property that contains an array of references to the child document IDs, and then the child documents are listed after that. So it's a little bit of a more complicated format if you're writing code to generate it on your own. But again, I do have an example on my blog that you can see for how to actually make it work. Now again, the other variation of the tree grid is if we want to see totals and counts. And this is a pretty nice feature because it gives you the totals just like you see in Notes client views. So if your category is collapsed, you'll see the totals in line. If the category is expanded, you'll see the totals under the last document in that category. But interestingly, to do a categorized grid with totals and counts, you actually need a different JSON format. But to me, fortunately, this one actually makes more sense, where you'd have your category level item here, and it'll have a child items property, and then it contains an array of all the documents that fall within that category. So to me, that conceptually makes more sense, although I do find it very strange that you need a different model for each kind. But essentially, you'll define your grid that way. You set up your data, in the format I've shown above, and then there's an aggregate property of the grid that you can set to either sum or count, and that will determine whether it'll total the data in the column or it'll just count the number of entries in the column. Just be aware that it handles numeric columns properly. It adds them or counts them, but it handles text columns in a very strange way in that it just concatenates all of the text in the totals row. So that is where our good friend the formatter function comes back into play yet again. We can apply a formatter function and have it filter out any text values that would show in a column total. So let's take a look at this. So we have this grid set up, and it's set up to display column totals, where there's just a 2 in every category here, And as you can see with the 16, it added up those values properly. Also to point out, as you can see here for this text column, it just took all that data and concatenated it in the summary row, which is pretty pointless. But I did just want to show at least what it actually will do by default. And you can see here for this, the first name summary column, I've actually applied a formatter function that will tell me if it's a category row and just return nothing. So just to be aware, this is the default behavior, but again, with a formatter function, you can easily suppress that. One thing to note, as I mentioned, that there's two different data formats that you need if you're displaying a categorized grid either with or without totals. In case you were curious, I had tried to use the simpler JSON format with a grid that does not use counts and totals, but it will work, but it'll actually leave a blank row where the counts and totals would be in every instance after the category. So that's definitely not ideal, not something you want to roll out if you're using a categorized grid that does not need counts and totals. You need to use the more complicated data format. And lastly, just to mention a couple of features that are available on the TreeGrid. There's a default open property, and that will just either default, expand, or collapse every category in the grid. There's an open at levels property, which is pretty neat. You pass it a number, and it'll basically only auto-expand the categories with less items than that defined amount. You know, back in our example here, I think I set this one to open at levels, and I passed it a number of 8. So it auto-expanded the Alaska category because there's less than 8 items. And as I scroll down here, you can see it auto-expanded the DC category because there's less than 8, but it didn't auto-expand these other categories here because they had, you know, more than that defined number. So that's what that open at levels property does. And finally, there is an expando cell property where you can define which column you want that expand collapse icon to display in. So of course, by default, it'll display in the first column, but if you have some need to move that, you know, you can do that with that property. Before we open it up for questions, I actually just want to mention again, I have added a page to my blog. You can see this here, Dojo Grids and XPages, that has a link to every blog post I've written. All the stuff I've talked about today, I have written about in a lot of detail. All the code is available there. So, you know, please make use of that and refer to it. If there's anything in here that you had questions about or want more detail of the sample code, you can find it there, or you can also reach out to me on Twitter. And with that, I will turn it back to Howard.
Thank you, Brad. That was very good information. Looks like that would allow us to really make some great looking XPages that can handle a lot of data. Let me first take control and remind everyone again that we're using the Q&A pane to ask questions. So that's in your WebEx interface. You'll see a Q&A pane. That's what you should be using. So let's see. Bear with me for 1 second. And so we did have a number of questions queued up already. So again, the Q&A pane is in WebEx. If you don't see it at the top, use the drop-down arrow, and sometimes it's hidden in there. But it's in the WebEx interface, and then make sure you ask the question of all panelists and not to any individual people. Just a reminder, while people are asking questions, that there are some upcoming events. The TLCC Spring Sale ends tomorrow at the end of the day. MWLUG and ICON UK, including those hackathons that TLCC is doing the day before or the day after. Team Studio has a sale going on of their tools, as well as the Ytria tools that they sell. And the next webinar will be July 24th on mobile app dev. And finally, TLCC will be, or not TLCC, but Team Studio will be at SoftBank in Japan. So, Paul, do you have some questions queued up? And actually, before I turn it over to you, Paul, Brad, just a question about the demo database. We've had several questions. asking how can people get a hold of the demo database. Is there one database, or is it just a question of going to the different blog entries to get the demos or the code for that particular technique?
At the moment, it's only the code exists in the blog entries. I am working on kind of tightening up a demo database that I will make available. I'm not sure exactly how soon, but it will be made available. It's just not yet.
Okay, thanks, Brad. So again, just to repeat, so everyone understands this, if you're looking for code or more exact explanations of some of the things Brad covered today, go to his blog, and as I said, I think you're up to 21?
21 that have been published, yes.
21 blog entries. So find the one you're looking for, and that's where you'll find the code that's available. There is no other database that you need to download for that. I got a question. I was thinking, Brad, when you were talking about moving the enhanced data grid and moving the things around that it saves the data. I assume that's only if you move a cell and not if you move a row or column, because that's coming out of the domino view.
Absolutely. Yeah, the column and row moving does not change anything with the data. It's only if you drag cell data around.
Okay. Great.
So you can rearrange columns and rows, but then as soon as you refresh the page, it'll reset to the way it started.
Right, because it's coming out of the view. Okay. And I assume that's only if they have access to change those documents, of course.
Correct.
Okay, Paul, do you have some questions queued up?
Yeah, I have a question from Bob, and this is a quick one, really just a confirmation, Brad. Does the Dojo Data Grid work with 852?
Only if you've got an extension library that has it. It is not a built-in control. It's not even built into 853 unless you run the separate installation for the upgrade pack. So it's basically always been a part of the extension library, but you get a subset of the extension library if you install upgrade pack 1 into 853, or if you have Notes 9, it's built right in.
So if you have 853 and you install the extension library, or sorry, 852 and you install the extension library for 852, then it would be available.
Yes, I couldn't tell you offhand which version of the extension library the control first became available in, but I do know that it's been a part of the extension library for a long time.
Okay. I think Bob, the person asking the question, had commented that I guess maybe he looked and didn't see the REST services there. So possibly that REST control is not there, but you could always write your own X agent that handled the JSON data.
Absolutely, and I have a couple examples of that with my blog posts on the categorized grids.
Okay, and by the way, Brad, have you tried using the Domino data services to get the JSON data for the data grids? I
have not.
Okay, that's just another option that's available in the 853 extension library in 9.0, the new Domino data services. Paul, did you?
Yeah, I have another one. Is there a workaround to sort the search results within the grid?
I think the only way you'd be able to handle that is if you wrote all of the logic to do the search yourself. I think if you're just typing a search term in and telling it to execute a full text search, it's just going to give you what it gives you and it's not sortable. But if your search button basically goes out and it gets data and returns a sorted collection of data, and you could display that on a separate page, that would be an option. But by default, you don't have that option.
Okay.
Thanks, Brad. We got a question from Kevin, and if you have multiple data sources, in his example, he says, suppose you have 3 databases with a similar structure, can all the results be returned in the same data grid?
I haven't tried that. I don't see how you would do that without customizing a search and providing the results yourself, though, because the REST service is defined to get the data from one view, and the search property would be searching that one view.
I think maybe an X agent here where you
went
to all 3 databases and then return the JSON formatted data would probably handle that.
Right, and that would have to be, you'd be returning your results to a separate grid that's defined, to read that document collection and display it.
Okay. There's a question from Samuel, and he asked, in the grid, is there like a quick search like the Notes client where you just start typing the first few characters of a row?
Not built in, but I mean, if you did like a Control F in your browser, you could probably do that kind of a search. But no, there's no function to just start typing and jump to something. If you wanted to approximate something like that, you might be able to put a field up there, and if the user started typing in it, you could kind of have it set the start row to that, to the first record that started with that text that you've typed already. And that's kind of one of the things that I was mentioning earlier, that when you go from the Notes client where you've got that kind of functionality built in, and then you take it right to XPages and you show them a view panel, but it doesn't have those features, then it's going to feel like a step backwards.
Okay, another question from Samuel. How would you do document locking?
Well, probably just prevent editing would be the first way.
Well, you do. I'm presuming that you do want to implement the in-view or in-grid editing. Is there a workaround or an approach to provide document locking as well?
Not that I'm aware of, because basically we're dealing with client-side JavaScript, and we're just the save function happens in the REST service. So this is sitting client-side. It's not going to have access to server-side content. I think you can write code that can determine what's being updated in the REST service, and then possibly have a way that it would kick off a server-side script and do some processing. But I can't say that I'm sure that's possible.
Okay, got a question from Ravi. Is there any way to export to Excel from the enhanced Dojo Data Grid? Yes,
I touched on it very briefly, but it was pretty quick. There is an exporter plugin that you can add to the grid. As I mentioned, basically the exporter function doesn't actually do all the exporting for you. When you tell it to export all or selected or a custom subset of rows, it basically gives you the data, kind of formatted and ready to export, but then you actually have to take it from there and actually write the data out. And unfortunately, because of browser differences and all that, it's a lot more complicated than it would seem. You would think with client-side script you could trigger something that would start a download, but it seems to work very differently in different browsers. So I worked out a solution, and I did write about this on my blog in the post about the export function, where we'll basically use an X agent, kind of pass that data to an X agent that will turn around and write it out, and save it as an Excel file. So that's the code for that's available on my blog in the post about the EnhancedGrid exporter.
Okay, great. There's a question from Greg. Is there a CSS file associated specifically with the grid?
Yes, there are a few of them, and they're in some of the slides earlier. But the path is to them. But there's one that's called grid.css. There's one that's called enhancedgrid.css. Those are kind of the two core ones that you need with the grid. But again, they're not things that you have to load if you're just using a standard data grid and using the control. But if you're creating a grid programmatically, those you do need to load just to make sure that the formatting is there. Or if you're using an enhanced grid, then you need to load the enhanced style sheet.
Okay, question from Andrew. How scalable is the grid in terms of the number of entries in the view? What are the performance issues and considerations?
I haven't worked with it with huge sets of data at this point, but I think with it being set up to use a REST service, that's kind of the point, is so it will scale a little bit more because it only performs lazy loading. You set the rows per page property, and you can tell it, load 25 or 50 or 100 records into memory at a time, and as the user scrolls, then it will go retrieve more data so that you're not loading all of that on the front end. But I have not done specific performance testing to tell you, how many rows it's going to work with well. All the demos I've been working with kind of has a subset of, as I mentioned, David Levy's fake names database, and it's got about 1,300 records in there, and it seems to respond very well. But I also know that many views get far bigger than that. So I think the REST service mitigates that because you're not loading all the data into the browser, right up front.
Okay. Question from Peter. I think we kind of touched on this already, but with the Dojo panel, can we show data from multiple views?
I think if you wanted to do that, I mean, by default, your REST service is going to select one view and do it, but you can compute columns in your REST service so that they look up data from other views and kind of merge it all together. So you could start with essentially a base view and then add columns, and when you compute a REST service column, it uses server-side JavaScript. So you could write code that goes and it looks up, whatever is related and adds it, in line next to that. So there's kind of like with any other XPages display control, we've got this ability now to look outside of the current view and compute other information to display alongside of it.
Okay, and then we have a question from Ravi. Have you seen any issues in IE 8.0 in terms of the data grid? We know there's a lot of issues, but in terms of the data grid specifically.
In general, I can't say that anything stands out. I've definitely noticed a lot of issues with IE9 running in compatibility mode, trying to be more backwards compatible. A lot of things that custom features have added to the grid just don't seem to do anything. So yeah, compatibility mode is where I've seen a lot more problems. With IE8, the testing I've done, nothing has jumped out, but I can't say I spent a lot of time, focused testing in that browser.
Okay, a question from David, and I think we're getting to the end of questions, Howard. One more from me. So this is from David. If the database isn't full text index, what will the search return?
An error.
I was going to guess that.
Yeah. Because I don't know that it gives you a good message, but there's nothing, it just can't function. So you can actually mitigate that by, on the search button, actually, you could have a couple lines of server-side JavaScript that say, if there is no index, add one. Otherwise, you could force an update on the index before a search, or just let it go. And certainly that would be more time-consuming up front, but that's one way that I've worked around it in the past.
Okay, and we'll take a final question from James, and I think this is just a little more clarification on what you said, but he's not seeing the enhanced data grid library in Designer. So maybe you can go over again, Brad, exactly the difference between the enhanced data grid and the data grid in terms of implementation, not going through all the details, but just the fact that how they're set.
There is only one Dojo Data Grid XPages control. And by default, it creates a grid based on the Dojo Data Grid module. So what I was showing earlier is basically how you can load the EnhancedGrid module from the server. It doesn't give you an extra XPages control in your control palette, and you're not going to see anything in Domino Designer that's going to say EnhancedGrid. But basically, that's going to happen in the browser. So you'll tell your page, you'll include an EnhancedGrid module to make it available on the page, and then you set a Dojo attribute, the Dojo type of the grid to be an enhanced grid, and then when the server generates that grid in the browser, it will generate it as an enhanced grid rather than a standard Dojo data grid. So you're not going to see anything different in Domino Designer.
Okay, thanks, Brad. And I think we're kind of out of time. Maybe we can just do one more. Dan had asked, is it better to use the view item file service or the view JSON service?
I can't claim to have any personal expertise on the REST services, but what I have read in the XPages extension library book from people who know it way better than me is that the Vue.json service is supposed to be more efficient in general, so that should be the default style to use. But to me, the big difference was when I wanted to edit columns and save the changes, if I used a Vue item file service, it worked out of the box without having to create a website document. So that's the primary consideration in my experience. If you still want to use a Vue.json service, you can save changes, but you need a website document that allows put operations on your website for that to work.
Okay, and I guess that could be important for many of us who don't use the internet sites and use the old way of doing it too. Okay, well, I'd like to thank Brad for coming in and joining us today to speak about this topic. I think it was very informative and definitely helps open our eyes to see just how far we can go with XPages in terms of the different ways to display data. It's just really almost unlimited, it seems like, the different ways we have to create an interface to display data. And so I encourage everyone to kind of review Brad's 21 blog posts and counting and learn more, as well as get the code. And then just as a reminder, we are going to send out an email to everyone who registered with a link to the recording of today's session, as well as a link to the slides. So with that, I'd like to thank Brad and Paul and Talene again, and wish everyone a great rest of their day.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.